Bienvenidos a un nuevo capítulo de Hablemos de Procesos. Hoy vamos a continuar la serie donde estamos explorando distintos libros que hablan sobre la gestión por procesos y algunos de mis autores favoritos que he tenido la oportunidad de contactar y ahora entrevistar para que también podamos aprender de viva voz desde su perspectiva y escuchar de ellos pues cuáles han sido las lecciones y aprendizajes a lo largo de su recorrido. Así que muchas gracias por conectarse. Hoy tengo la dicha de contar con un invitado desde Australia, así que vamos a dar la bienvenida en unos segundos a Roger Tregear. Y Roger, solo para darles un poquito de contexto, nos acompaña desde Australia. Él es autor de varios libros. Hoy vamos a estar discutiendo uno en particular, pero pues es un experto en temas de BPM. So, thank you very much, Roger, for being in our show today. It's a privilege to have you here, and it's an interview I've been looking forward in quite a while because I know your agenda is pretty busy. So I appreciate you making the time and joining us for this video today.
Hello, Diego. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be joining you. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. As I've explained in previous videos from this series particularly, we'll be going through some of the books that I personally enjoyed and that I've learned from as I continue on this path of learning about business process management. So let us go ahead and get started. And I would like for you to please briefly introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about your BPM background and how is it that you even started involved with business process management?
Thanks. Yeah. So I really stumbled into business process management. My original degree is in electrical engineering, and then I worked in a computer company here in Australia for some time. In that, drifted into data and then telecommunications and got into consulting at that point. And then that moved on into management consulting. And there was a day, I remember it very well, that I went to a presentation that an academic who's now a friend of mine gave, and he was talking about process modeling and process improvement, and I guess some implications of process management. And that was an eye-opener for me because it told me that there was a name for something that I'd been kind of doing for some time, which was, trying to understand how stuff got done and how we could do that better. And that was part of the kind of management consulting work that we were doing. So ever since that time, and that's like 20 years ago, I've been doing little else but process management, business process management, or process-based management, as I would prefer to call it. So, I stumbled into it. So people sometimes ask how to replicate, how to get into a career of BPM consulting, and I don't know, get lucky.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I've heard that a couple of cases now where it's not something people are just wake up one day and saying, hey, I want to pursue a whole career in business process management. It's more something you start doing, and then as time passes by, you start learning and connecting the dots because it seems like there are so many concepts out there that it could benefit from business process management, but perhaps we're not necessarily as acquainted with some of the best practices, concepts, and techniques that are available.
It's probably easier now to be more deliberate about it. In my time at university and early work career, you hardly heard the term process, let alone process management. But of course, it's much more common now. But it has many meanings now. So if you want it to be deliberate, you've got to, at some point, decide which flavor of BPM is of most interest to you. But yeah, it can be more deliberate now. It doesn't have to be so random.
All right. So we're going to be talking today particularly about your book, which is called Reimagining Management. And can you briefly describe, for purposes of the audience who has never heard about it, what's the book about? I mean, in essence, if we take the book right now in online, whether it's an online format or the actual physical document, what can we expect to find when we start going through this book?
Yeah. So the purpose of the book and the content of the book is, as it says on the cover, I thought long and hard about the name, and I had many options, but reimagining management is actually what I mean and what I encourage. And in brief, it's saying that I have this thing I call the primacy of process. And it's a view of an organization that has two perspectives. We have the vertical organization, which is the organization chart. So it's up and down how we manage our organizations, and that continues. But we know that in every organization, we get work done across the organization. You know, someone does something, another part of the organization does something else, someone does another bit, and eventually we have some customer, other stakeholder interface. But the work gets done across. And yet, for the most part, we manage up and down. You know, and who's in charge across? What does that even mean? You know, the org chart says nothing about how we manage across the organization. So it's not replacing the organization chart or the functional organization. It's just saying we need this process horizontal overlay, this additional management piece to correct what is a kind of vision problem. You know, we're not looking across the organization, which is the way in which we create, accumulate, and deliver value, which is the same as saying that's the way in which we execute our strategy. So, you know, and who's in charge? Nobody? Well, that doesn't sound like a great idea, huh?
Right. And I also like the fact that if we look at the long title, it also says putting process at the center of business management. So that kind of assumes that for years now, we've looked at business management without necessarily focusing on processes. And perhaps looking at a process from a partial perspective and not from a holistic understanding. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So some people have this like very minimalist view of a process. It's a sort of boxes and arrows view. It's just a string of activities.
Yeah.
But it's much more fundamental than that. I mean, it's the way in which we create, accumulate, and deliver value. And of course, other people. I had this discussion just recently with a senior executive who said, "Why are you trying to model and manage processes? I'm trying to get rid of processes." What? I mean, so this is the point of view where you think process is what stops all the good stuff getting done.
Yeah.
Whereas our view, I'm sure, is that process is the only way you get anything done.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I agree with him in the fact that bad process stops things happening. But, you know, we can't get rid of all processes. We just obviously want to get rid of the bad ones, you know.
Absolutely. And you talk about a couple of enablers that will help us to reimagine management per se. So you talk about 7 enablers in your book. Can you talk a little bit about them? And
Sure.
Is there a particular order in which we should approach them, or they're just pillars upon which we should establish the foundations of our business process management endeavors?
Yeah, so that's right. So they're the 7 enablers of BPM, as I call them, and there are 7 of them, and they're equally important. And if any of them are missing, you'll have a problem. And therefore, you need to be developing all 7 more or less in parallel to give yourself a good chance of getting effective process management and sustaining effective process management. I'll just quickly name them. They're fairly self-explanatory, I guess, but and they're all important. We all need them all, but I'll start with architecture, process architecture, because we need to make the process visible. You know, if we don't know what our processes are, then obviously we can't do much else. The next enabler is measurement. We want to know 2 things really about measurement. How is it performing and how should it perform? That gives us a performance gap. And the third enabler is process governance, and it's really about how we relate to that performance gap. Do we care? What's the impact? How are we going to close it? How do we prioritize it? We've got hundreds of processes, perhaps thousands. Which ones do we want to work on? The 4th enabler, it's the middle of the list, but fundamental to everything we do, is called process change. So this is the piece where we're actually improving a process. And if we're not doing that, then by our own process definitions, we are waste, and we should be eliminated. That would be embarrassing for process practitioners. The next one, the 5th one, is process mindset, and that's about building a process-aware culture across the organization. 6th is process capability. And by that, I mean the normal English meaning of the word capability. It's just giving as many people as possible the skills, the training, the expertise, the experience to be able to contribute to all of this work. Because it's not, you know, we want everyone to be involved. We will have, the 7th enabler is support, and we will have a central group, you know, the Center of Excellence, Center of Expertise, Office of BPM, whatever you might want to call it. And they're the kind of super users. They've got the process superpowers. They understand everything really well. But you can't let you can't build the whole environment around them doing every piece of process improvement, because if you do that, they'll become a bottleneck. They become the office for the prevention of process improvement, because people are queued up waiting for them. So they're the 7 enablers. They all work together. They're not independent variables. You work on one, you'll impact a couple of others. Work on 2 or 3 of them, you're impacting all of them. And that's a good thing, of course, because it lets us do development. But you need a plan for each one. None of them will happen, organically or by some magic. You need to consciously think about it, how you develop it. And we're not talking about doing it for hundreds of processes either. You could do it for one if you wanted to. We can be a little more adventurous than that, but it's incremental in the way in which we roll this out across the process architecture.
And that was exactly going to be my next question, whether we could approach them as the enablers of the capacity or the capability of business process management as a whole, or the actual enablers of a particular individual process. So from what I'm understanding, you could actually look at it from both perspectives. You could take just one particular end-to-end process and say, okay, how do I evaluate my maturity for that particular process at the light of these 7 enablers? Is that correct?
That's right. So I think, we all know what we mean by continuous improvement. I'm not sure too many organizations are actually doing it. It's not so continuous and there's not enough improvement, but we know what our aspiration is for continuous improvement. I think we need to match with that continuous management. And essentially that's about making high quality evidence-based decisions about which processes we should be analyzing and trying to improve. Because we literally have hundreds or indeed thousands of processes, depending how deep we go in the process architecture, the hierarchy. And we always have a limited amount of resource we can apply to analysis and improvement, but that's a limited resource that we're applying to effectively an infinite space. So we need to make decisions, and the best decisions we can make, the better the decision we can make, the better the improvement will be. So continuous process management is dealing with all of the processes, as it were, and then continuous improvement would look at particular processes. It's a process that's got a problem, or we've got a new idea, some new technology that we can work on. So I think we need both of those things, and when they come together, that's what I call process-based management. I use the term BPM, but by it I mean a holistic management philosophy.
And I'm sure
because it sounds for some people it sounds like software or technology or automation or whatever, and I don't. I don't do that. I'm about process management and improvement. So,
and that's part of also of some of the misconceptions that we've found in the past when people talk about BPM, whether it's looking at a particular software, they think it's just the implementation of technology. And I've been trying to create that awareness as we go through these different type of interviews of all the different pieces that make business process management, and why is it that it's so important and so relevant for us to be looking at this. Now, we could probably spend hours talking about the 7 enablers, but let me focus on one particular that I feel like more and more I've had the question asked in different forums. How can we develop a process-driven mindset? How can we get people to start adopting that mindset? And I also used a quote recently in a presentation that I had, where I took from your content and I said, according to Roger, it's 90% about the mindset and 10% about the tool set. So can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Sure, yeah. So in my courses and workshops, I often do a little exercise where I ask people to rank the 7 enablers from hardest to easiest for them in their organization. And of course, it's different for different people in different organizations and at different times, but commonly, and my experience as well, the hardest is mindset, because we're talking about changing people's minds. Obviously, that's a good thing, of course, that it's hard, because if we can change their minds, it's also perhaps hard to change it back. So, we might have captured them for good. 90% mindset, 10% tool set. We need 100%, of course. I'm not saying that by tool set, I mean tools and techniques and all of the other bits. We need all of that for sure, but we need people to think process before they're going to do process. We need to, and have that shared across the organization. Why do we even care? So we go back to my executive I mentioned earlier, who really has this very negative view of process. He wants to get rid of it. well, if we've got people in key positions who think like that, then it's not going to work, is it?
Right. Yeah.
So we need to have this shared understanding. It's not so complicated, I don't think. I mean, it's that vertical and horizontal I was talking about. And if in the horizontal, the process direction is the way in which we deliver value to products and services to customers, and no one's managing it, well, the conclusion from that is we need to do something different, something new. So you can get to that point, but we all need to understand that. And I often say to executives, you don't want to be able to just listen to these presentations. You have to be able to give them, because people ask them questions and they need to have a shared view across the organization. What we mean, why it's important, what we're doing, how we do it, why me as an individual inside perhaps a large organization, what I need to contribute, what my role is, so we need to understand all of that. And that takes a bit of explaining, it's not just a matter of, a 1 hour PowerPoint session. I mean, you have to really explain it and explain it and explain it, and then demonstrate it. And then link those two things together. Here's the theory and here's the practice. Here's the problems we tried to solve. It's all about, if process-based management is going to be useful for anyone, it's got to be seen as a solution, not a new problem.
Absolutely. And I think what I've seen is also that there's kind of like a competition between different forces, because I've heard people saying they want to be a data-driven organization, or they want to be a process-driven organization, or they want to be a digitally driven. So it seems like there's so many drivers to compete right now that where do you start? Where do we start among all the different options that are out there? And of course, there's all these fancy terms and these sexy trends about digital transformation and automation, or digital process automation. So I think that BPM has found a space in there where people has started to look at the core and say, wait, before we do all that, we got to look at our processes. Do you think that in a sense there's a new wave of business process management, that there's a new interest and a new peak of people looking at BPM from a new perspective as a result of all these trends around?
Yeah, I think so. And I think more and more senior people in large organizations are actually getting that message. That principle, what I think it was the main principle of process-based management, the vertical and the horizontal, I call that the primacy of process for a reason. The process is the prime artifact. I mean, it's the way in which we deliver value. And sure, all of those other, the usual suspects of more general enterprise architecture, the data and the systems and the rules and people, and all of those things are necessary, but they're necessary to support the execution and management of processes. That's their role. If we don't have a process, we don't need data. So if we're going to be driven by any one thing, for me anyway, that's process.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I completely agree. So let me ask you, if you could ask your readers to take away just one thing out of the book, what would be that key takeaway you would like them to walk out after reading Reimagining Management?
So I think the main idea is that in organizations, we spend most of our time managing up and down the organization chart, mainly down, I suppose, but occasionally we manage up. And the org chart defines accountabilities and responsibilities and authorities and delegations, and that's all perfectly okay, not suggesting we change that. But while we're spending most of our time managing up and down, we actually deliver value, that's products and services, to our customers across the org chart. And if nobody's managing that, then what? We're just hoping it all comes together okay? And that's not in anyone's vision or mission statements, We hope it all works out nicely. I said no one's ever written that in their strategy document. So if that's missing, and we need to do something about it, okay, well, what are we going to do? Well, that's Reimagining Management is all about that, because it describes the enablers and some other techniques to think about that and to make it happen in a incremental way, with the appropriate risk profile. We're not trying to change the world overnight. We can do it a piece at a time and prove it and
So have you seen any good implementations in companies that either you're consulted with or that you had the opportunity to interact with, where they've taken that ownership, like you're saying, that horizontal perspective, whether it's through a process owner or a process steering committee or a process center of excellence, whatever the role might be? Are there any recommendations or best practices that companies can start looking to or reaching out to so that they can embrace this journey and eventually adopt this horizontal perspective that we're talking about?
Yeah, so there certainly are examples. Many of the examples, of course, particularly from commercial organizations, they're not too keen on people talking about because it's, just by default, consider everything confidential. But there are some organizations increasingly now who case studies get written and papers produced at conferences. So there's the largest bank in Australia, the Commonwealth Bank, has done a lot of work in process, and they've identified their high impact processes, and they're actively end-to-end managed, measured, managed. They've done an enormous amount of work there. And there's a paper to be published soon. Perhaps it's already published. I'll check that for you and give you a link if it's publicly available. I think it is. If not now, then soon. There's also, in a commercial sense, there's an organisation in New Zealand called Zespri, and Zespri are the people who export kiwi fruit. And that goes, I think, to some 56 countries around the world, and most of it comes from New Zealand, but they're growing now in other parts of the world so they can grow all year round. And I've had some involvement with Zespri for a long time now, and they've done a lot of great work there. It's very active. You can imagine their complex processes to ship container loads, shiploads of fruit from New Zealand through to Europe and the US and whatever. The complexities of that are horrendous, but they've got huge impact. They had a huge impact from process-based management. There are many organisations in Saudi Arabia. I know you recently interviewed with my good friend Bassam Al-Qarashi, and I've been working with Bassam and his colleagues in ES Consulting there for must be nearly 15 years now. And lots of organisations there are doing some seriously good work. Government organisations, government ministries, really getting stuck into the whole idea of cross-functional process-based management. So we're getting more and more examples. I wish I could say, here's the database that's got 500 great examples. Just talking to a colleague recently that, we really need to build that database somehow.
Sure.
But there are plenty of examples that we can use and others that we can talk about one-to-one with people, but we can't publish the details.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. You've given us a couple of really good examples there. I will definitely be looking out for those. So as I said at the beginning, you wrote a couple of different books. Like you mentioned, we talked with Bassam the other day about the fundamental establishing the office of BPM. Now we're talking about reimagining. I know you also came out with questioning BPM with a couple of other authors. Are you currently working on any other book, or do you have any other book on the horizon coming soon that we should be looking out for?
Yes, well, it's on my to-do list. It's been there for too long. I'm supposed to actually get on and write it. But there is a book that it would be a follow-up to Reimagining Management, if you like, a kind of field guide to doing all the things that Reimagining Management talks about. It's quite a practical book, as you know, reimagining, but it's more to do with the theory. It doesn't say do this. It's not a project plan. So I've always had in mind to do a follow-up book to that would spell it out in more practical detail. But it's on the list.
It's on there, yeah. And before we leave, do you actually have any other books from other authors that you particularly are fond of, or that you suggest when you started learning about business process management? Was there any particular book that just changed the way that you started thinking about BPM, or that it served as an influence even to your own writing process?
So there are two books that triggered, the two books that I read when I got some interest, and I thought, what else do we need to, and how can I find out more about this? And this was 20 years ago, so there weren't a lot of books, but the two that I remember being most impacted by was a small book written by Andrew Spanies called BPM is a Team Sport. And it's a little kind of fictional novella thing, just a small book, but really kind of laid out, what process-based management nirvana looks like, really. Okay, yeah, this is what we need. The other one in that very early time was a book by Alex Sharp and, he has a co-author, McDermott is his name, I'm pretty sure. Sharp and McDermott, and that's called Workflow Modeling. Very deceptive title. It sounds a very technical book, but it's
book, yeah.
So Andrew Spaney and Alex Sharp have really been good guidance for me. But then there's the other classic books, Paul Harmon, Roger Belton, Tom Davenport's Process Innovation was one of the earliest books. Probably everyone should read Hammer and Champy, Re-Engineering the Corporation. I mean, that's that was published in probably 1992 or something. So it's old, but it's it's one of the seminal books. And then I also I got onto the whole Toyota production system stuff. So there are books out there, reproduction of books by Toichi Ono and Shigeo Shingo. Right back there, it's about manufacturing, of course, but you can see in there the basis of everything that we talk about. So, so they're the sort of classic books that have been useful for me. Obviously, there's lots more books now. If you were to search for that on a online bookstore, you'd get lots and lots of hits. 20 years ago, not so many.
Not so many. Well, that's exactly why we came up with this series, to offer new resources, particularly to Latin American viewers who, to your point, don't yet have as many resources in Spanish. So hopefully we're creating awareness, we're creating a little more expectations so that people in Latin America can start looking out and reaching out to some of these books. Even if they're a little old, I'm sure there's a lot of jewels worth reading there. So thank you very much for the recommendations.
We're currently translating Reimagining Management into Arabic, so maybe we should do that in Spanish. In Spanish,
for sure. I'm sure our readers will love that as well. So,
if you've got any ideas about that, I'm happy to hear about them.
Great. Now there you have it. Who knows? Maybe somebody watching the video will start shooting you an email and try to connect, so we can start getting that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, is there any final words? Any last message you want to close before we wrap up?
Look, I think the thing we've got to do when we're trying to, evangelize the whole process-based management idea, we've got to get to executives somewhere, and we've got to tell them the story about the horizontal and the vertical. If you hear that story, we manage up and down, but we create products and services across, and nobody's managing across. If you can explain that properly to an executive, I've never had anyone say, no, that's not right. Because you can't. It's a fact, And then the question is, who's managing across? Who's doing the end-to-end thing? And when the answer is nobody, then okay, now we've got to do something. All right. The next hurdle is, that sounds like we need to change the world. It sounds like the world peace problem, I call it. It's a great idea, but we don't know what to do about it. Well, reimagining was all about saying, no, it's not. We're not trying to boil the ocean here. We can do it one process at a time, if you like. We build an architecture, and then we'll incrementally roll out process-based management across the organization. So I think that's the kind of message we've got to get, and ultimately, we've got to get that message to executives. If we don't have direct access, then how do we get there? How do we exercise some influence to get to that point? And then once the right executives buy in, then okay, let's get on with it.
Yeah. Well, Roger has a great website that I'm going to share with the audience so that people can look for it, because there's a lot of resources there and a lot of information about blogs and and events that you've done in the past as well. So I'll share that on the video so people can look in and log in and read more about some of the content.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Bueno, con eso entonces llegamos al final de este video. Muchas gracias a todos por conectarse. Espero que les haya gustado. Si no lo han hecho, suscríbanse al canal y déjenos sus comentarios para saber qué les pareció también este capítulo. Así que muchas gracias. And Roger, thank you once again for being in our show and for making the space for talking to us.
Gracias.